Hello there. So it's time for the first off-script sort of commentary video. Um, just discussing some topics while we're going through all these reviews. So stick around and we'll get to that. I wanted to say before we start to subscribe, obviously, follow me on TikTok where I will be posting the individual reviews and they'll be coming out earlier on TikTok than on YouTube because I have to put them all together for YouTube. I can just upload them individually on TikTok. And then the second thing is for the future of these commentary videos, I want to respond to any comments or any kind of discussion on these videos, whether they're on YouTube or on TikTok. I want to start a conversation about games and what we think about them, and even just like the industry in general, because I find it interesting, and I hope that I can at least entertain you, but also maybe you can find something interesting to talk about in there as well. I love all your opinions. But seeing as this is the first commentary video, there isn't really any comments to talk about at the moment, but maybe for the next one. So instead, I'm just going to get right into my little story here. I wanted to discuss a topic because we're talking about retro games at the moment. The last video was the NES review, and the next one will be going into the Genesis. So you know, this first leg of the race, if you will be pretty much all retro stuff, and we'll get more and more modern. But for that, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we should maybe look at retro games in a modern light, and there's a bunch of ways to approach critically thinking about modern video games, or sorry, retro games. And I think they all have fair points. And I also want to discuss my approach. So using the NES as an example, because that was the last one, I want to talk about what perspective we use when we talk about old games. Now, for me, for the NES, I didn't grow up with the NES. I wasn't born yet, so I don't have a lot of nostalgia for the NES era. I mean, I feel like I have a little bit of secondhand nostalgia just because I have been a consumer of video games for so long. I know sort of the history of the NES. It's kind of this monolithic figure in the gaming space. But for me, I don't really approach retro games, especially of this era, with a lot of nostalgia. And I tend to be a little more critical of the retro games, especially the NES, because my approach is that age just necessarily kind of weakens the quality of particularly games, just because they have been kind of riding technological innovations throughout its history. And so when you get more modern games, they tend to have more bells and whistles, and they put the older retro titles in a less favorable light. Not to say that they're bad. I mean, I gave Super Mario Bros. An 8 out of 10 because there are still games that hold up, and I feel like Mario is one of them. But you know, nowadays we have like the new Super Mario Bros. Series. We have the 3D Mario titles. Like if you don't like OG Super Mario Bros. And if you have no like nostalgia for it, I don't see a reason to go back to old games like that. And so when I look at games, especially from the NES and Genesis and Super Nintendo, I tend to look at it more like, what can this game do in order to get you to bring out an NES, or you know, download an emulator, which I'll get to in a second. But that's kind of the approach I'm coming at it with. And that kind of brings me to the next little sub point here, is that how forgiving can we be of old game design? Because I watch a lot of reviews online, and especially for the retro titles, I hear a lot of excuses, might be a harsh word to use, but there's a lot of people like I saying, "Oh, that's just how games were back then." It's forgivable. It's not a big deal. And I just think that sure, game design back then was a lot different. But I'm not sure that is a reason to like. I'm not sure that's something that should be overlooked, or like made as an excuse. Like that's still a real factor into what makes somebody want to play a game or not. So when I look at games, that's kind of or retro games specifically, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm a little more harsh towards these ones. And that's why my average score for these are going to be a little lower than some of the other ones coming up. But there are still a lot of ones that hold up. And I think that's just because they stand the test of time. And you look at retro games, the retro games that hold up to me have even higher marks just because they have been able to stand up against more modern design, which is kind of like tailored around what we like now, because that's something that has been largely figured out, if you ask me. So, yeah, I'm not really big on forgiving old design aspects. Like, for Tetris 2 as an example, original Tetris, amazing, super simple. Like, you can get into it, play as long as you want. It's like amazing game. But we didn't know how to make sequels back then, and so Tetris 2 was like not the same game. And I'm not really willing to say, oh, that we just didn't know how to make sequels back then. Tetris 2, it's still fine on its own, like Tetris 2 is okay. But like if I'm playing a game called Tetris 2, I want to play something that feels like Tetris, because that's how games work. That's how sequels generally work in media. And just because game developers didn't know how to handle that back then doesn't mean that it's not a problem. So that little rant aside, I wanted to talk about the barrier of entry for retro games. Depending on who you ask, it can either be like really high or really low. Some people will demand that you get original hardware and cartridges and all that jazz, and that shit's expensive nowadays. So I wouldn't really recommend that. And then other people will say all you need to do is download an emulator and start playing, which I tend to agree more with. I think emulators are good. I think they're fine. But even still, like you have, if you're watching this video, you generally have like a console already, like a Switch or a PlayStation 4, Xbox, a PC with like Steam. So I still even think that like downloading a program and figuring out the files and ROMs and all this stuff, like trying to find ROMs online, that's still like a decent barrier of entry, because you can't just go on Steam, search for Adventure Island, put in your credit card information, and there you go. You have to search for that stuff because the legality of emulators is a little iffy, and so it's kind of harder to find stuff. And there's also just not a lot of curation for emulated libraries. The general attitude tends to be we need to preserve all the games that we have, and so we're going to put as many games as we can in there for the sake of preservation, which I think is good. But at the same time, if I'm looking for a retro game to play, I have no idea what's good and what's not, unless it's something that we still know, like Mario or Zelda. Yeah, and so on the topic of like emulators, I want to talk about save states real quick because I will be using save states in the future reviews. And I think they're absolutely fine. I hate people who are like, you have to beat this game without save states because you're not a real gamer if you don't do that. Like, we all got our own lives, so like just whatever people have to do in order to feel comfortable playing a game, to make it fit into their schedule. Like, don't rag on people for that. Okay, like you don't need to always feel superior to other people just because you beat Mario without using a single save state. And yeah, I that's kind of what I wanted to say about retro games. I think you can approach it in a bunch of different ways. I tend to be more critical. If you've grown up with Nintendo NES or just this like era of retro games, I think people tend to be more favorable towards it, and I think that's totally fine. I have my own nostalgic era of games that we'll get to eventually, and I tend to give them higher scores because that's the shit that I grew up with, and whether or not it's a great game, I still enjoy it, and that's what I'm generally ranking my enjoyment. So I think it's totally fine. I think that's kind of the beauty of different perspectives, seeing different reviews and the conversation about video games, because there's no one answer. It's all about context. So if you're watching me, hopefully that provides a little bit of context on my approach to retro video games, and so you know a little bit more going forward. And I would love to discuss that in the comments or in future videos. So yeah, I think that's about it for now. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you during the Genesis review. Stay tuned for that.